Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a journey into something pretty fundamental, really. What happens after you eat?
Right. It sounds simple, but biochemically, it's fascinating.
We're cracking open a key chapter from Marks Basic Medical Biochemistry. It's called the fed or absorptive state.
Exactly.
Think of this as a shortcut to understanding how your body handles every single bite, turning food into fuel, building materials, reserves, the whole shebang.
That's the plan. Our mission today is to walk you through that intricate biochemical ballet that kicks off the moment your body starts absorbing
A
nutrients.
valet, I like that.
Yeah, we'll look at how your body digests, distributes, and stores everything you consume. We'll highlight the key players, the pathways involved. It's really foundational stuff in metabolism.
And we'll try to make it clear even without diagrams in front of you.
Absolutely. We'll guide you step by step.
Okay, so let's unpack this term first. Fed state. It sounds like more than just, feeling satisfied after dinner. Is it really a distinct phase?
Oh, absolutely. It's a very specific metabolic period. The fed, or absorptive state, starts right when nutrient absorption begins, and, well, it lasts until that absorption is pretty much complete, usually a few hours.
Okay.
And during this window, the carbs, lipids, proteins, everything you ate gets digested, absorbed, and then your body has to decide. Do we burn this now for energy, or do we shuttle it off to, let's say, fuel depots for storage?
Right, it's sort of a crossroads.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the key decision makers, the conductors of this whole thing, are two hormones, insulin and glucagon. Their balance basically tells your body if it's time to build and store or time to tap into reserves.
Got it. So let's follow the food then. First stop, carbohydrates. Our main quick energy source, right? How does the body take something complex like, say, bread or pasta and get usable sugar?
Right. Good starting point. Your body has this really efficient multi-stage breakdown crew for carbs. It actually starts a bit in the mouth with saliva.
Salivary amylase.
That's the one. But the real action is in the small intestine. Pancreatic amylase does a lot of work. And then there are these specialized enzymes, like molecular fizzers, right on the gut lining.
Mm-hmm.
They snip the larger sugar chains, disaccharides, trisaccharides, into the simplest units: glucose, fructose, and galactose.
Okay, the basic building blocks.
Exactly. These single sugars are then absorbed by your intestinal cells and boom, straight into the hepatic portal vein. They make a beeline for the liver. It's super efficient.
Wow, straight to the liver. Okay. Now, what about proteins? Building blocks for muscle, enzymes, everything. How do those long chains get broken down into individual amino acids?
Proteins are also complex chains, yeah. And digesting them needs another set of powerful enzymes, proteases. It starts in the stomach, actually, with pepsin getting things going.
Right, the acidic environment.
Correct. Then, in the small intestine, a whole team of pancreatic enzymes, trypsin, chymotrypsin, and others, takes over, breaking the chains further.
So more snipping.
More snipping. And the final step happens right on the surface of the intestinal cells. More enzymes finish the job, leaving you with individual amino acids. And just like the sugars, these amino acids also hop into the hepatic portal vein, heading for the liver.
Fascinating how targeted that delivery is. Okay, now for the tricky one. Fats. They don't like water, which makes digestion, well, complicated. What's their unique pathway?
You nailed it. Fats are special because they're hydrophobic, they avoid water. So the body uses a clever trick. First, dietary fats, mostly these things called triacylglycerols.
Like in oils or butter.
Exactly. They get emulsified by bile salts in the intestine. Think of bile salts acting like detergent, breaking big fat blobs into tiny droplets.
Ah, increasing the surface area.
Precisely. That lets pancreatic lipase, the fat-digesting enzyme, work much more effectively, breaking them down into fatty acids and something called 2-monoacylglycerols.
Okay.
These smaller pieces then form these tiny structures called micelles. Little delivery vehicles, you could say.
Got it.
Micelles ferry the fatty bits into the intestinal cells. But here's the twist. Once inside, they get reassembled back into triacylglycerols.
Really? Why?
Well, they then get packaged up again, this time with proteins, phospholipids, and cholesterol, into larger transport structures called chylomicrons. These are like little water-soluble cargo ships.
Ah, so that's how they travel in the blood.
Well, almost.
Oh.
Because they're still quite fatty, they actually bypass the portal vein initially. They get secreted into the lymphatic system first.
The lymph, okay, different route.
Yeah, and eventually the lymph drains into the bloodstream, letting these chylomicrons deliver fats all around the body. It's a neat workaround for the water problem.
Very clever. Okay, so now we have glucose, amino acids, and these chylomicrons circulating. The body needs to manage all this incoming traffic. What does this mean for those hormones you mentioned, insulin and glucagon?
Right. This is where the regulation comes in. After a meal, especially one high in carbs, your pancreas gets the signal. Its beta cells release insulin.
The main player in the fed state?
Definitely. Insulin is the big abundance signal. It basically tells your cells, especially muscle and fat cells, hey, lots of glucose available, open the gates, let it in.
So it facilitates glucose uptake.
Exactly. Either for immediate energy use or for storage. Now, conversely, the other hormone, glucagon, which is made by the alpha cells of the pancreas, gets suppressed.
Why is that?
Well, glucagon's job is usually to tell the liver to release stored glucose between meals when blood sugar might drop. But right after you've eaten, you don't need that. You've got plenty of fresh glucose coming in.
So insulin up, glucagon down, build and store mode.
You got it. The body prioritizes using and storing the incoming nutrients.
Okay, let's zoom in on the liver again. It's the first stop for glucose and amino acids from that portal vein. It must have a massive role in handling this post-meal rush, especially the sugar.
Oh, huge. The liver is the metabolic powerhouse. It grabs a big chunk of that glucose coming from the intestine.
What does it do with it?
A few things. Some of it gets burned immediately oxidized just to power the liver's own functions. It needs energy too,
Makes sense.
The rest, a significant amount, gets converted into glycogen. That's the short-term storage form of glucose, like a readily accessible fuel tank. After a big carb meal, your liver can store maybe 200-300 grams of glycogen.
That's quite a bit. But what if that tank is full? What if you eat lots of carbs?
Good question.
Sure.
The liver is smart. Once glycogen stores are topped up, it doesn't just waste the excess glucose, it starts converting it into fat, specifically triacylglycerols.
So that's how carbs can turn into fat.
That's a major pathway, yes. This newly made fat is then packaged into another type of lipoprotein called VLDL, very low-density lipoprotein, and shipped out from the liver into the bloodstream.
Okay, so VLDL carries liver-made fat, chylomicrons carry dietary fat.
Exactly. Two different origins, similar transport job.
Now, besides the liver, what other tissues are major players in using or storing this glucose flooding in after a meal?
Several key ones. First, the brain and nervous system. They are highly dependent on glucose.
Right, they need a constant supply.
Constant and significant. They burn glucose almost exclusively for energy, needing about 150 grams a day. They're very sensitive to low blood sugar. Glucose is also needed to make neurotransmitters there.
Critical tissue. Who else?
Red blood cells. They're unique. They have no mitochondria. The powerhouse is in other cells.
Oh, interesting. So how do they get energy?
They rely entirely on glucose using a process called anaerobic glycolysis. They basically break glucose down just partway to lactate to get their ATP. Without glucose, they can't function, can't transport oxygen.
Wow. Okay, brain, red blood cells. What about muscles?
Muscles are big glucose users, especially when active. They can use glucose directly from the blood or tap into their own glycogen stores.
Like the liver's glycogen, but for muscle use.
Correct. And after a meal, that insulin signal strongly encourages muscle cells to take up glucose and replenish those glycogen stores, getting ready for the next bout of activity.
Makes sense. And adipose tissue, fat tissue.
Adipose tissue is also very responsive to insulin in the fed state. Insulin ramps up glucose transport into fat cells.
What do they use the glucose for? Just energy?
Partially for energy, yes. But importantly, they also use glucose to synthesize the glycerol backbone, a key component needed to actually store the fatty acids as triacylglycerols.
So glucose helps facilitate fat storage in fat cells too.
It does. It provides part of the structure for those stored fat droplets.
Okay, let's circle back to those fat transporters, chylomicrons from the diet, VLDL from the liver. What's the main takeaway, the big picture on how they work?
The bottom line is they solve the water insolubility problem. They provide a safe, effective way to move fats and cholesterol through your watery bloodstream.
Right, the cargo ships.
Exactly. And as these ships, these lipoproteins, circulate, especially through the capillaries in adipose tissue and muscle, there's an enzyme on the vessel walls called lipoprotein lipase, or LPL.
Okay, another enzyme.
Yep. LPL acts like a dock worker. It reaches into the chylomicrons and VLDL, breaks down the triacylglycerols inside, releasing the fatty acids.
So it unloads the cargo.
It unloads the fatty acid cargo. Those fatty acids can then enter the nearby cells, muscle cells for energy, or fat cells for storage. In fat cells, they combine with that glycerol made from glucose and get restored as those large fat droplets.
And our capacity for that storage is pretty big.
Oh, very extensive. We're quite good at storing fat. The remnants of the chylomicrons and VLDL, now depleted of much of their fat, are mostly cleared up by the liver, though VLDL remnants can also morph into LDL, the bad cholesterol.
Got it. Okay, we've covered carbs, we've covered fats. What about the amino acids from protein? You said they're versatile.
Yeah.
How does the body use them after a meal beyond just muscle repair?
Very versatile indeed. Remember, they also travel via the portal vein straight to the liver first.
Right.
The liver is a major processing hub for amino acids. It uses a good portion of them to synthesize its own proteins, which it needs constantly. It also makes crucial serum proteins, like albumin, that circulate in the blood.
Okay, proteins for the body's structure and function.
And much more. The liver uses amino acids as building blocks for tons of other vital nitrogen-containing compounds, things like heme for red blood cells, some hormones, neurotransmitters, even the purine pyrimidine bases needed for DNA and RNA synthesis.
Wow, they really are fundamental building blocks.
Absolutely. The liver can also use amino acids for energy if needed by oxidizing their carbon skeletons, or it can convert those skeletons into glucose or ketone bodies. The nitrogen part, which can be toxic, is safely packaged up as urea and sent to the kidneys for excretion.
Efficient disposal, too.
Very. And then, many amino acids pass through the liver and enter the general circulation. Other tissues, muscle, brain, etc., pick them up to synthesize their own proteins, make other specific molecules, or just use them for energy. There's this constant dynamic pool of free amino acids in the blood, fed by diet and protein breakdown, ensuring cells have what they need.
It's amazing how interconnected it all is. Now, this is where the theory hits reality, right? Let's talk about the clinical case mentioned, Ivan A. His story really grounds these concepts.
It does. It's a classic example. Ivan came back to his doctor weighing 270 pounds, quite heavy, and crucially, with a 48-inch waist.
48 inches, that sounds significant.
Very significant. His blood pressure was high, 162/98, and his blood lipids were, well, not good. High total cholesterol, high triglycerides, high LDL, the bad kind, and low HDL, the good kind.
A worrying picture.
Plus, his fasting blood glucose was 162 milli-GDL, which is well above normal, leading to a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes.
Okay, so how does his obesity connect to all those biochemical pathways we just discussed?
It connects directly. His large amount of adipose tissue, especially that abdominal fat, has contributed to insulin resistance. Remember how insulin signals cells to take up glucose in the fed state?
Yeah, opens the gates.
Well, in insulin resistance, the locks on those gates are sticky. The cells in his liver, muscle, and fat tissue aren't responding properly to insulin signals.
So glucose stays high in the blood.
Exactly, causing his hyperglycemia, his high blood sugar. His obesity also makes his heart work harder, just to pump blood around that extra mass, contributing to his hypertension and those high lipids. That dramatically increases his risk for atherosclerosis, plaque buildup in arteries leading to heart attacks and strokes.
It's like a cascade effect.
It really is. And the family history mentioned likely adds a genetic predisposition layer to his lipid issues.
You mentioned his 48-inch waist. That apple shape is a particular red flag, isn't it? Why is where you store fat so important?
That's a critical point. Ivan's large waist circumference indicates what's called an android or apple-shaped pattern of obesity fat concentrated around the abdomen.
As opposed to a pear shape.
Right. The gynecoid or pear shape is more fat around the hips and thighs. And research clearly shows that the apple shape carries significantly higher health risks.
Higher risks for what exactly?
Higher risk for hypertension, cardiovascular disease, hyperinsulinemia, which reflects that insulin resistance, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. That abdominal fat is metabolically more active and harmful.
So Ivan's symptoms, the obesity, hypertension, bad lipids, diabetes, they cluster together.
Yes, this cluster is often called metabolic syndrome, sometimes syndrome X. It's a constellation of risk factors that massively increases the chances of developing heart disease, stroke, and diabetes.
And the first line of attack is?
Lifestyle changes. Non-pharmacologic interventions are crucial first steps. Caloric restriction, getting more exercise, modifying the diet. These can make a huge difference in managing these interconnected problems.
It really highlights how central these metabolic processes are to overall health. Now, besides blood tests, how do clinicians actually measure body composition, like that waist circumference, to assess these risks? What are these anthropometric measurements?
Anthropometry is basically using body measurements to get a handle on nutritional status and health risks. They're practical tools.
Like what?
Well, the most basic are weight and height. Simple, but used to calculate BMI, body mass index, which gives a rough idea of body fatness relative to height.
Okay, standard stuff.
Then there's skin fold thickness, SFT. This gives a better estimate of total body fat.
How does that work?
Since a lot of our fat is just under the skin, subcutaneous, you use a special caliper to gently pinch a fold of skin and fat at specific sites like the back of the arm, triceps, or the thigh, and measure its thickness.
Ah, okay. Provides a more direct fat measure.
Exactly. Another one is arm muscle circumference, AMC. You measure the circumference of the upper arm, and then you can actually use the triceps skin fold measurement to estimate the muscle circumference underneath the fat.
What does that tell you?
It reflects muscle mass and can be an indicator of protein and calorie adequacy, helping to assess malnutrition, especially the marasmic type where muscle wasting occurs.
Got it. And then the big one for Ivan.
Waist circumference. As we discussed, it's a critical indicator of abdominal obesity, that high-risk apple shade. It's measured horizontally around the natural waistline.
And there are specific cutoffs.
Yes. For men, generally, a waistline over 40 inches or 102 centimeters is considered high risk. For women, it's over 35 inches or 88 centimeters. Ivan's 48 inches clearly puts him in that high-risk zone. It correlates strongly with that dangerous intra-abdominal fat.
Simple measurement, powerful information.
Very much so. Sometimes a waist-to-hip ratio is used too, but waist circumference alone is often a better predictor of these specific health risks.
So bringing this all together then, we've really journeyed through the biochemistry of what happens right after you eat this fed state.
Yeah, from the detailed breakdown of carbs, proteins, and fats,
To how hormones like insulin and glucagon act like traffic cops.
directing nutrients to different tissues, each with its own job, whether it's the brain needing constant glucose or adipose tissue storing energy.
It really is an incredible system of coordination.
It absolutely is. And this deep dive into the fed state chapter really underscores how interconnected everything is. Understanding these pathways, how glucose is handled, how fats are transported, how amino acids are used, it's fundamental.
Fundamental to understanding both normal health and what goes wrong in diseases like diabetes or metabolic syndrome, like we saw with Ivan A.
Precisely. His case makes it very clear how disruptions in these fed state processes like insulin resistance can have serious clinical consequences.
So for you listening, this isn't just, abstract biochemistry. It's the foundation of how your food choices every day directly impact your body's inner workings and your health down the line.
Every meal sets off this complex, beautifully regulated sequence of events,
Your body is constantly adapting.
which leads to a final thought, maybe something for you to ponder. We've seen how adaptable the body is in this fed state, handling influxes of nutrients. But what happens if you're constantly in that state or very frequently in it, maybe due to consistently eating more than you need?
Right.
How might that prolonged pressure on these pathways, constantly high insulin, constantly storing, potentially lead to permanent changes? Could it alter how these metabolic systems function in the long run, maybe contributing to the chronic diseases we discussed?
Something to think about indeed. How does chronic excess change the machinery itself?
Exactly. A question rooted directly in the biochemistry we explored today.